War is gruesome, it's bloody, it's ugly. But if you lose sight of who is the aggressor, if you lose sight of who is the one that is responsible for all the suffering, then everything falls apart. Your moral clarity falls apart. The sad thing is that when it comes to other wars that the West have fought, where there's been so much civilian casualties, no one's been blaming the West or the one that's fighting the terrorists for being the evil one, for being the aggressor. This is Erin Molan stating some essential points about what's happening in Gaza and understanding who is to blame here, and more importantly than that, what needs to be done to bring this suffering on both sides to an end. Have a watch.
I'm going to keep this really short and really simple so it has the best chance of making an impact. Pointing out that a child that is being used as the face of famine in Gaza is not starved, but a victim of a genetic disorder and a muscular disease does not mean that you don't care deeply about children in Gaza. In fact, the fact that you are committed to the truth means you care more, because no child in Gaza can be helped if people are lying about why they are suffering and how they are suffering. Again, children are suffering in Gaza, absolutely. It is a war zone. It would be horrific there. And the whole point of pointing out who is to blame is not so that people can wash their hands of it and walk away. No one is saying Israel is not to blame, therefore let's leave it as is. There's no denial, there's no justification for it. It is horrific, and we should all fight it every single day. But if you are blaming the wrong person, you will never help them. If you are excusing the terrorists who are responsible for their suffering, you will never help these children. The war will never end as long as the West continues to perpetuate this false narrative fed to them by Hamas, by the Iranian regime, by Qatar, by terrorists. I've said it a million times. Israel is not perfect. The Israeli army is not perfect. The government is not perfect. Their operations have not been perfect. Of course not. No army ever is. No organisation ever is. No country ever is. But the war they are fighting is just. What would you do? You tell me right now, if Israel lays down arms, walks out of Gaza. The day the last ceasefire was brokered by the US, the head of Hamas went on national television and said, "We will carry out another October 7 the first chance we get." Hamas still have capability to kill, and they have shown that they are willing and able to do so in mass numbers. There are also still hostages in Gaza, Israeli hostages, innocent people. So if Israel walks away now, their hostages rot, die, never to be seen again, and Hamas, still with killing capability, rearms, rebuilds itself, and carries out another October 7, as they said, at the first available opportunity. What country could ever do that? They don't have a right to exist and protect their people. They have a duty to. Now, they have brought more aid into Gaza than any other country in the history of war. 2 years' worth for 2 million people. You want to know why it's sitting there in trucks? They've brought it in. You want to know why the UN is not handing it out? Because in Gaza, the UN is Hamas. Remember the images of UNRWA employees, UN employees taking part in October 7? They don't want to hand out aid. They want the world to think that Israel is evil and is withholding aid. It works in their favour. Look at what's happening in the world at the moment. They are winning. They are sitting there going, God, even we could not have envisaged our campaign to be this effective. I mean, we're terrorists. We're bloodthirsty, slaughtering terrorists. Even we could not have predicted the West would have lapped this up as much. Even they would be shocked. Apportioning blame to the right people for the suffering of these children is the only way they will ever be helped. Whilst Hamas has power in Gaza, not only is Israel under threat, but more so their own people. They kill their own people. They hurt their own people. They weaponize their suffering because look how bloody effective it is. So again, care deeply about every child in Gaza. Share images globally, front page of people suffering in Gaza. Don't lie about why they are suffering or who is to blame, because you're then part of the problem. You are prolonging this war. Again, Hamas will not commit to a ceasefire. Why would they? Why would they want the war to end? Look at what's happening around the world. Look at how effective their propaganda has been. Whilst the world excuses them and blames the wrong person, children will continue to suffer. So again, I say, if you care deeply about children, and I do, I fight for these kids every day. If you are sharing terrorist propaganda and you are blaming the wrong person, you will never help them. They will suffer forever. You've got to wake up to it, or you are part of the problem here.
Absolutely 100% right. Israel cares 100 times, a million times more about Gazans, innocent Gazans, than Hamas ever will. To the point where I would say to a fault, where they're laying down the lives of their own soldiers to be as surgically precise as possible and letting in aid into an enemy war zone, the majority of whom, until recently, because they're now losing, supported what Hamas did on October 7th. And yet the world points the finger at Israel. It's Israel's fault. Hamas knew they could count on this. It's sick. Their strategy is make their own people suffer so they can bring Israel to their knees. This is their last hope now, because they're closing in on Hamas. Hamas is on its last leg. And so they know that the only way that they can get the international community on their side is to steal aid, to create a circumstance in which their people suffer. And then what happens? The international community says, Israel, you have no right to be in Gaza. You have no right to fight Hamas because you're causing all this suffering. And then they're allowed to survive. That's what is going on, and we can't allow this lack of moral clarity to persist. I want to read to you the words of Jonathan Sacerdoti, who said, "Why is Israel forced to sabotage itself?" He wrote this in The Spectator. He said, Israel's recently announced a tactical pause in several sectors of Gaza aimed at facilitating the distribution of humanitarian aid. It's not merely a gesture of compassion under fire. It's a tactical adjustment born of necessity, and certainly not a shift in moral posture. To understand this move properly is to grasp the complex interplay of military constraint, media manipulation, psychological warfare, and political coercion. The decision to implement a daily 10-hour pause in military activity in areas such as Al-Mawazi, Deir al-Bala, and Gaza City reflects more than an internal policy shift. It reflects the immense and at times irrational external pressure placed on Israel by international actors, moved not by objective fact, but by a meticulously engineered campaign of imagery and emotion. What has been presented to the world as a humanitarian necessity is in truth the product of a questionable narrative manufactured by Hamas and amplified by a complicit media ecosystem. That narrative, relentlessly promoted, is one of famine and mass starvation, with Israel cast as a deliberate agent of human suffering. Images of skeletal children and desperate civilians, often of dubious provenance, have flooded Western media. Israel has long worked to prevent humanitarian collapse in Gaza, even while engaging in military operations. Hundreds of aid trucks pass into the strip daily. Calorically and logistically, the supply is sufficient. The breakdown, crucially, is in distribution. Hamas seizes trucks, sells aid at inflated prices, and uses hunger as both a coercive internal tool and an international PR weapon. By the way, there's recently been footage that's shown of Hamas stealing aid. It's so important that you see this. Let me just get this up for you. Okay, this is a clip of Hamas stealing aid, which the IDF have released. Whereas the aid footage from just 4 days ago shows Hamas terrorists looting an aid truck. This is the same organisation spreading false claims about a deliberate starvation campaign in Gaza. The evidence is there. It's just whether you want to look at it and see it or not. The strategic use of civilian suffering has allowed Hamas to manufacture outrage that in turn translates into diplomatic pressure on Jerusalem. While the starvation narrative is falsely exaggerated and the depiction of Israeli intent as cruel or indifferent is entirely fabricated, it is also true that some hunger and shortage now exist. These are not the result of Israeli policy, but deliberate Hamas engineering. Any relief Hamas permits will not be due to concern for its population, but because it is extracting a strategic benefit, time to regroup, concessions from Israel, or PR advantage, and it will not hesitate to throttle aid again if doing so serve those ends. I mean, I ask you, dear viewer, imagine if there was a benevolent government overseeing Gaza, and we saw that they had all these trucks of aid. Do you really think they wouldn't be access to the people of Gaza? Do you really think they'd be lying in these massive empty spaces and not being distributed? It is so obviously the fault of Hamas. It is so obviously all of this that we're seeing. The war, the suffering was all calculated by Hamas. It's something Israel should reflect on. Because the more they drag this out, even if they're trying to do things that limit collateral damage, it's playing into Hamas's strategy. Maybe if they'd have acted more comprehensive and quickly, it would have meant that Hamas's strategy fell apart. And maybe that the international community would have been on with Israel when they had that 2-week window of international sympathy. Jonathan continues, the role of the UN and particularly UNRWA further complicates the picture. Israelis and independent sources have long documented the deep infiltration of these agencies by Hamas operatives. In recent weeks, Israel allowed international journalists into Gaza to witness the massive stockpiles of aid the UN has refused to distribute. Aid cleared by Israeli checks and held up only by UN inaction. Only once exposed and embarrassed did UN agencies begin moving trucks. The resulting chaos, captured on video, showed the UN's operational dysfunction, contrasting sharply with the more disciplined efforts of the US Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. High-level sources confirmed to me that GHF trucks have never been raided, while UN trucks have repeatedly been hijacked, mobbed, and violently taken over. Numerous videos have documented these episodes, underscoring the vulnerability and dysfunction of UN-led distribution. The political echelon in Israel is under pressure on multiple fronts. President Trump and the US administration have leaned heavily on Jerusalem to show a humanitarian face. Internally, Netanyahu must navigate criticism from both right-wing parties and security professionals. Some argue that the IDF should distribute aid directly, severing Hamas from its stranglehold on civilian life. Others, including sources close to Netanyahu, insist the tactical pause is essential to preserving operational freedom and denying Hamas the international sympathy it craves. These pauses, however, are not cost-free. Colonel Yaron Buskila, CEO of Habiton Nistim, warned that humanitarian corridors risk creating de facto ceasefires, granting Hamas time to regroup. The structure of the pause itself, daily 10-hour windows from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. in designated areas where IDF operations are scaled back, provides predictable, exploitable gaps for Hamas. While Israel pauses, Hamas does not. It continues to exploit the calm to fortify its infrastructure, rebuild command centers, repair tunnel networks, and reposition fighters. On the propaganda front, Hamas uses the visibility of these humanitarian pauses to bolster its victim narrative, claim the international moral high ground, and deepen the sense of equivalence between itself and a sovereign state. In addition, Hamas will use the lull to study the movements of aid convoys and Israeli logistical patterns, gathering the intelligence that allows it to more effectively sabotage humanitarian operations. This learning curve is not theoretical. Recent weeks have seen an increase in the lethality and precision of Hamas attacks against Israeli troops, a direct outcome of its ability to study and adapt as operational patterns emerge. The cessation of hostilities for aid delivery becomes a two-pronged weapon, operationally beneficial for Hamas and psychologically corrosive for Israel. The current negotiation framework for a hostage deal further illustrates this asymmetry. Hamas offers a slow drip of some living hostages and bodies of those it has killed, in exchange for a lengthy 60-day ceasefire. This would be a strategic boon that would allow it to rehabilitate while Israel stalls. The demand to shift aid back to UN control and away from the GHF is part of the same plan, to reassert control, regain legitimacy, and cripple Israel's ability to bypass Hamas's influence in Gaza. This is the bitter paradox. To maintain moral and strategic legitimacy in the eyes of its allies, Israel must act against its own operational interests. It must enable aid it knows will be exploited, allow actors it knows to be compromised, and accept international narratives it knows to be false. These tactical pauses are not humanitarian victories. They are defensive moves in a war where images matter more than facts, and where the battlefield extends as much into living rooms and newsrooms as it does into Rafah and Khan Yunis. In this arena, Hamas has one comparative advantage. It is not constrained by truth, and too often, neither are its media allies. That Israel continues to function under such constraints is not a sign of weakness, but of discipline. Ethical discipline. But discipline is not immunity, and in a war of attrition fought with lies, even the most moral actor can be coerced into a corner. And this is the one part where I disagree with Jonathan, actually. Because I know it may sound counterintuitive, but actually I think by Israel playing these games with Hamas, playing into the fact that they use human shields and thus having to protect their own people, sacrifice their own people, their own soldiers' lives in order to be as surgically precise as possible. By fighting in ways that where the hostages kind of dictate policy almost, means that we are negotiating with terrorists and letting them determine how we fight these wars. And I actually think, contrary to what many may think, if we stop trying to appease the international community, but fight the way Jewish morality always taught us to fight wars, which is you don't incentivize terrorism by negotiating with them, you don't let them dictate the way you fight. And a civilian is someone that surrenders. Israel, the IDF, cannot be expected in the heat of battle in urban warfare to be responsible for knowing who is and who isn't a civilian when you're fighting in the fog of war, and Hamas dress often in civilian clothing. They start this war. They are the ones who went in and massacred the Jewish people and Israelis on October 7th. And we go in there, and Israel is held responsible for all the deaths, despite having the lowest ratio of combatant to non-combatant in the history of urban warfare. Jewish morality says, you do whatever you need to do to stop your aggressor from ever being a threat to you. And all the loss of life that occurs there, if that is what you're doing, if you're not just killing for the sake of it, killing a people for the sake of it, if you're just simply trying to go and stop an aggressor, you have the moral right to do that, you have the duty to do that, and the suffering, the moral onus lies with the aggressor. So actually, I think if we were to say, we're done. We are done. We're going to now fight this war swiftly. We're not going to let Hamas determine or guilt trip us into how we fight. I say that actually the international community would respect that because it makes sense. It should make sense to all of us that negotiating with terrorists or letting them dictate the way you fight a war is not moral, because it incentivizes more terrorism and it leads to more suffering on both sides. I said in the previous video that we need to get more decisive as an Israeli leadership in having a long-term plan, even if it may sound radical, because maintaining the status quo is, I would say, even rightly upsetting the international community. Their critiques of Israel and who is to blame is unfair, yes. But saying this can't just keep going on indefinitely where you keep maintaining the status quo, I think they're onto something there. It shouldn't be in Israel's interests to want to have to keep maintaining this constant cycle of terrorism and security threats and violence. We need to start looking at something radically different. And we shouldn't be scared. Indeed, as I learned recently, the most commonly used phrase in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, by God, is do not fear. We should not be afraid. We should not be afraid of speaking the truth and doing what the truth tells us to do. The Islamic Republic of Iran. For over 4 decades, its leaders have stood defiantly, their voices thundering through Tehran's streets, chanting death to Israel and waging a relentless war on the West. But what fuels this fierce, unyielding hatred? Is it politics? A grab for regional power? Or something even more profound? A theology that casts Israel and the West as cosmic enemies in a divine battle for the end of days. In this JTV Plus documentary, we embark on a journey to unravel the apocalyptic beliefs at the core of Iran's revolution. We'll uncover the sacred Shia doctrines that prophesy a world reborn through chaos, where a hidden redeemer, the Mahdi, will rise to vanquish evil, with Israel and America as the ultimate foes. We'll dive deep into the mystical visions of a global Islamic order, where martyrdom and jihad pave the path to divine victory. We'll explore how these ancient beliefs shape Iran's every move, from its fiery rhetoric to its deadly proxy wars. From the revolutionary sermons of Ayatollah Khomeini, who ignited a nation, to the shadow wars of spies, cyber attacks, and missiles that have pushed the region to the brink. We'll trace the arc of a regime bent on reshaping history, and we'll reveal the climactic moment when Israel struck back with Operation Rising Lion, a daring, high-stakes operation that shook the world and redefined the conflict. This is not just a story of a nation, but of a creed that seeks to rewrite the future, a conflict that threatens to engulf us all. Join us as we expose the hidden truths behind what Iran sees as its sacred mission, its unrelenting rage, and the battle for our world's destiny. To watch this JTV Plus documentary and access much more premium content, click on the link in the video description.